without them, and then
like standing on an intersection. Hey, Justine.
Hello.
We are live. I tried to catch you off guard, bloke, whilst you were telling everyone about how it's the natural state of affair for men to leave their wives, but unfortunately I came a little bit too late. Good evening, everyone. Let's go through the panel and see how everyone's doing. It's a nice chilled Sunday with a completely non-political book. Let's go through. Who have we got? We've got Freelance. How are you doing, Freelance?
I'm a bit scattered.
It is a scattered community. Quack House, how are you?
I'm all right.
The bloke?
I am okay.
Well, this is a cheery start. How are you, Justine?
I'm recovering. I'm fine. I'm a little bit recovering. We went to an actual barbecue with actual human beings at it yesterday. So.
Did they serve meat?
They did. They did serve meat. They served drinks, meat. It was very strange. It was like being washed up on a strange island.
It sounds like a really outrageous tale, Justine. Like it's too good to be true. I have a hard time believing that this actually could exist. On to Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah, something far more realistic. Gulliver's Travels. So yes, as you can see, this is going to be an episode on Gulliver's Travels. We won't spend too much time on Swift because if we get into him, we could just be talking about him for several hours. I've put a quote down from him about satire, which, as we get into the book, people can understand why. Yeah. I think before anything else, let's address the common misconception of Gulliver's Travel, in which it's being a kid's book. I looked into this to try and find out when this perception changed, and it looks as though there was an abridged version published in 1776, which was the start of when people it only had the first two voyages, so it was only when Gulliver goes to Lilliput and Brobdingnag. Pronunciations will be a bit scattered, but so I think that this publication in 1776 was when the perception of it being a children's book started to come in, because it was pretty much understood it wasn't previously. So anyone listening that thinks I'm not going to read that as a children's book, it's not. Let's go around and see what people think. Who likes it? Was it people's first time reading it, or were they already familiar?
It's not my first time. I like it very much. I see it as being sort of sandwiched in between Utopia and Alice in Wonderland, in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
I'll expand on that later, maybe.
What do you think, the bloke?
I'm enjoying it. I still haven't actually finished it, but I'm going to contribute what I can. It's the first time I've read it, and I had no idea that it was what it was. I've only ever heard of the sort of film and TV versions, or rather only seen the depictions of those, and they're obviously very much like children's movies and things. So I was surprised that it was what it is, basically.
Yeah, and yet the language is it's not excessively complicated, so I can see how it would lend itself to a children's book in some way.
Yes, I think Brandick, who isn't here to correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think that he thought it was on par with much older texts. So he thought it was a bit difficult to get through in terms of the language, not because he can't read it, but just it's not as neat and easy to read as some of the other ones we've looked at.
I thought it sounded quite modern, really. It felt quite modern.
Maybe the references are obscure if you don't know the era that well,
Mm-hmm. Yes,
that's definitely true.
Yeah, which I think we'll get onto more as we go through it. There's a lot of little hidden references to contemporary events. I don't want to spend too much time on Swift because we would be here all day. So I'll just move it on to Freelance. I don't think we got your thoughts on. Is it your first time reading? Or
I kind of knew it from movies and the children's version. So I thought that the first half of the book was not as good as the second half. I enjoyed the second half a lot more because then he actually it feels like he's going more into satire. The first one is just like, look, I'm in odd situations, and the second half he starts delving into history and basically on how society actually works, and that was much more interesting.
Yeah, there is a hell of a shift, I think, after going to Lilliput and Brobdingnag. I think it really does transform when he goes to Laputa onwards, really.
I mean, it's good that it gets better, but I think there's a lot of interest in, especially the shifts from, in terms of perspective. Like one reason I'd say it's similar to Alice in Wonderland is that in Alice in Wonderland, you have, Alice getting big, Alice getting small, right? And having that telescoping, like, constantly going on. So you're invited to see Lilliput as, could quickly realize that it's really England that he's visiting in most respects, I would say. And that he's trying to...
Yeah, and we'll point out these references as we go through. Mm-hmm. So just touching on what the legacy has kind of left us with. So I've put Yahoo there because with Swift, he actually provided us with far more words than I even thought. Obviously, Swift as used is a Swiftian retort or something to that effect is quite often used, as a witticism. But Swift also, as well as the word Yahoo, which we'll come on to later on, coined truism, modernism. There's quite a few different things that are used in common parlance that Swift was responsible for. As well as that, I'm going to pass this to Freelance to explain, but as we have in Gulliver's Travels, big and small end war, there is that term is being used in Freelance, why don't you take the stage, because I'm not going to be able to explain it at all.
Well,
you can explain
the Lilliputians have a war, and that's basically about whether you should, when you open an egg, you should start at the pointy or the round end of the war, of the egg. And this is a bit like the war the mock war they have in Sweden, whether you should put the butter on the smooth side or the side with the holes of the knekkebröd. And then the losing side the general of that side has to eat the knekkebröd, and he will also always eat it with the butter turned down because he's holding the knekkebröd upright. So you have these wars, these discussions about things which are just arbitrary conventions. One of these things where the word big and small, big and little endian is used is in byte order in computers. So whether we put the right from on the top, from if we want to encode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in hexadecimal, then we can put the smallest byte first, or we can start with the biggest byte. And that's basically a lot of networking has to deal with this. And things like PC Express buses. So it's still something that is used. So if you go to a computer engineer and you talk about endianness, then he will think about byte order, and that's something that refers back to the Lilliputians in the book.
Well, Swift wants to suggest that people will always find something to fight about, I guess.
Yes.
We're invited to believe that the big endians are essentially Catholics and the little endians are Protestants.
Or different kind of Protestants. You have the same, whether you should baptize a child once or 3 times.
Yeah, these
and it's funny, when I was rereading that part, I felt hints to Hume when he's talking about human nature. But Hume was 11 when this was published, so obviously it would have been, if anyone was influenced by anyone, it would have been Hume influenced by Swift.
Yeah, absolutely. Swift is so characteristic of his age, and that satire was very much the favored discourse of the time. He was close friends with Alexander Pope, and I think of The Rape of the Lock, if people know that mock epic poem, and you have a similar kind of idea that like everything in Rape of the Lock is tiny and like it's a story, it's a poem about how somebody cut someone's a lock of hair off, and then there's a big giant falling out over it. So it's the rape of the lock, as in like the ravishment, the kidnapping of the lock, and there's a very similar kind of structure where it's satirical, and there's a sort of idea of pettiness in this, very similar to the Lilliputians.
Yes, and this sort of like post-Enlightenment smarmy writing. I've not read any Voltaire, but it's kind of the perception that I have of him is sort of a French Swift. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's the image that I have.
There's something to that, certainly. Like this kind of mocking, aren't human beings irrational? Let's be rational. There is that sort of side to it.
Yes, and I think when we get to the end, it's also going to be interesting to see what people think about rationality, because there's debate as to whether or not in this Gulliver sees human nature as being changeable, to being closer to the society he encounters at the end, or whether or not it is hardwired, and he just laments over it as being something he's stuck with. A couple of other things we have on there. Laputa, the society that we'll come up to later on, is also a film of some kind. Am I doing that justice, freelance?
It's an anime by Hayao Miyazaki from Studio Ghibli. He also made Totoro. So,
shall we explain? So Laputa is the sort of scientific place, which I think is a sort of satire of Bacon's New Atlantis, right, or the House of Solomon, where there's a sort of a land where scientists rule, and everything is about science.
Yes, and it's the first lambasting of this idealization of everything having to be rational. Which again is in some ways in conflict to the ideal the society that he encounters at the end, because they also are purely rational beings. But in Laputa you see an environment in which they're all navel gazing, and nothing actually gets done, whereas
they do interesting things with cucumbers.
Later on, we see a society which could be quite similar, but seems to be functional. Nothing else on there that bears.
Why do you have a picture of Mother 2 there? Also known as Earthbound.
Because there's loads of references to Lilliputs and Lilliputians. As either reference to something that's incredibly small, or something that is so small in terms of like a nuisance that is not something to be concerned about. So it can be used in either sense, but just to allude to how it's infected the culture, I've put that because one of the levels is called Lilliput Steps. Sorry, carry on.
Oh, I have a tendency to see through Wizard of Oz colored glasses, but I did think there's a bit of influence there as well, especially with the Munchkins, like landing amongst the Munchkins and being a big person.
Yes, and both of them have had postmodern interpretations of it being a fever dream or a drug-addled nightmare. So I suppose that's also similar.
But any postmodern interpretation is basically saying it's a fever dream, or like if you deconstruct it, then you're left with the parts, and then you have to try to reconstruct the original again, which doesn't work. Like one of the scientists tries to do in the book with excrement, trying to turn it into food again by removing the bile and saliva.
I think for the kids, they just took the excrement out, so there's quite a lot of it.
Yeah, I actually tallied how much reference there was to urine and excrement. There were 5. Sorry, there were 6. Yes, so plenty of reference to it. But again, it's done in a it's not really a childish way. It's kind of puerile, but with a bit of it's done. I don't know. It's not, it doesn't feel childish to me anyway. It feels entertaining. It's not something I usually find particularly funny, but there's a way that Swift does it that is because he uses so much euphemism and he almost over uses the euphemisms that it kind of has a sense of humor about it.
He's that guy who does those hilarious Roman history, unbiased Roman history. Have you seen those?
I've heard of the channel, but I haven't actually seen it. No.
Extremely funny. Well, I think there may be some there too, because whenever there's a barbarian in the story, they're always throwing crap at people. It's very Yahoo.
Very Yahoo. We need to bring back the term Yahoo.
Yeah.
We need to start formulating a Magnum Opi dictionary. There's been several terms that we've come across. Waxy was your favorite quack house from memory.
Yeah.
Talking about terms, the L word is in this book, so I don't know if you want to put it on the front of the shelf.
Let's.
You're gonna have to explain.
Yeah.
L word.
Lanyard.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
The epitome of intelligentsia. So we've gone 16 minutes and not actually given a summary of the story. So who wants to give a quick explanation of what actually happens in the book?
Sure. A man goes against all advice on 4 travels, gets an arrow to the knee and stops being an adventurer and decides to be a horse.
Tries to be a horse.
Yes. Thank you for the footnotes. I also had that pop into my mind that he was an adventurer until he took an arrow to the knee, which I don't know. It's probably a bit of a childish reference now, but I found it insane. So let's go to the first land in which he lands upon. Some of the images were terrifying. There's something about this that's, I don't know if it's the uncanny valley. It sort of looks like it's a photo that's been adjusted rather than a picture. It's a little bit strange, but
probably because it's slightly out of focus.
Yes, yeah. So the first place that Gulliver lands after being in a wreckage is Lilliput. So what happens in Lilliput?
Well, Gulliver washes up after he's a ship's doctor, and he washes up after a tempest. He's shipwrecked. He washes up on the shore. He falls asleep on the shore of a land, and he wakes up to find himself tied up. And they're by a lot of tiny people who are, it says 6 inches high, I think they're supposed to be.
Yeah, 1/12 the size of a regular man.
Yeah, and yet they want food. The food seems too much to me, isn't it? Isn't there like a wrong calculation with the food? Because they say, you need 1,270 or something times as much food as we do.
I'm guessing it's 12 cubed is what they calculated it as being.
Right.
But I might be wrong on that.
That's more than.
Anyway, carry on.
At first, he he's bemused for the most part. At first, like he's taken aback, but he's kind of bemused by these people, and he thinks they're sweet and toy-like and beautiful. They seem perfect in terms of physically. They seem perfect, but then he gradually realizes that they're incredibly petty, which I think is the relevant word, like small and and also petty. You know, their concerns are very kind of trivial and niggling, and they're very fractious. We talked about big ends and small ends. There's also the high heels and the low heels. The high heels, I think, are roughly the Tory party, and the low heels are roughly the Whigs. Swift was a Tory, by the way, an Irish, like Anglo Irish Tory. And so then they're fighting with a neighboring country, Blefuscu, which is basically France, and he kind of gets involved in their war, and then eventually he falls out with them, goes to Blefuscu, and then he has to leave.
Yes, just on your points about them appearing perfect at the beginning, it's the beginning of what we see of Swift's fascination of the grotesque in the human body, which kind of, these are the opposites of that. But when we get to Brobdingnag, and we see them, there's a lot of grotesque imagery, and also with the immortals that he encounters later on. Which I just ran to the bookshelf to grab. I've got a book of his poetry. I'm trying to pick it out, but I remember there are a few love poems, quote unquote, that he sent to his bit on the side, I suppose, that made reference to the aging of his body and her body. So there's a sort of endearing love of the fact that the human body is frail and will degrade, because it gives an appreciation of when it is not in a degraded state. So for him, it's sort of when it's in it, we can age gracefully and sort of love the imperfections. For Swift, that's quite a big theme in quite a lot of what he writes.
Yeah, it turns out that the perfect little people are radically imperfect, whereas the Brobdingnagians are better people, even though they seem grosser because they're bigger. Yes,
yeah. Well, and it's also the fact that the bigger something is, the more easy it is to see the imperfections of it, which I could be an allusion to this, to also him being in the societies and seeing the issues. But sorry, carry on.
One important aspect of him being in Lilliput is that the Lilliputians see him as a threat constantly, which he is because he's so big. While when he's in Brobdingnag, he is seen as a pet and cared for and carried around and seen as a curiosity, and totally not a threat for everybody. But he's constant under threat. So that's a big difference between those two situations. So I can imagine that there's animosity in Lilliput because he is such a disruption on them. It costs a lot of resources to maintain because of all the food that he consumes and the risk that he has by just walking around.
He's just by existing, he threatens them.
Yeah, well, when he's in the land of the giants, then he's a curiosity and he can easily be ignored. So he's kind of a luxury. He has his own servant and things like that. So not to it costs some resources, but not as much that it's basically disrupting a whole society.
Yeah, he strains the entire economy of Lilliput just by existing.
Yes, and I always think that ideal fiction makes you want there to be more. It should always leave you wanting more and thinking, well, what if this happened, or why couldn't they expand on this? Which I really get with Gulliver's Travel, because there's so many scenarios that he encounters, and it's concise enough. There's detail in it, but it's never bloated. So that kind of discussion that they're having, that he's told about when they have a meeting of all of the officials talking about what they should do with him, because he's a burden, because he's eating several hundred animals a day to keep him alive. So why don't we just kill him? But if you do that, then his body's going to rot and cause disease. I don't know, that scenario. There's something about that. Kind of sitting down in a council discussing what to do with this giant that's just landed on your shore that I found really interesting. Yeah. I love that. I love those little pieces where it makes you think, I want to read more of that. But
it's one of the themes in this book also, that some societies will be really cruel in dealing with stuff. You see that later on as well, when he's basically seen as abhorrent by most people, and decided that he should be put down because they just can't have it from I think a moral point of view.
But they're all very accommodating for the longest time, aren't they? I mean, he's extremely accommodating to them. I mean, at any point he could basically just go, couldn't he?
Which he says. Yeah, he says that he could very easily destroy them, but he doesn't really want to resort to that. And there's also, with Lilliput being England, there's also a reference to English being very law-abiding, because sorry, when I grabbed the book, I didn't hear whether or not you touched on this part, but a fire starts in the palace, and to put the fire out, he urinates on the palace. which the king is then eternally hateful towards it. Well, no, that's not what causes the king's hatred. It's that he wouldn't destroy the other island and subjugate them. So they decide to punish him, but they don't want to kill him. So they decide to poke out his eyes and then feed him less and less, so that he'll eventually starve to death. What's written into the story is that the expectation is that he'll be overjoyed at the fact that all they're going to do is poke out his eyes. It's kind of an expectation that he'll be thrilled about the fact that they're not going to kill him, and willingly submit to getting his eyes poked out. So there's a kind of hint that the English are very law-abiding peoples.
It was his friend in court that suggested it.
Yes, yeah.
And they even said, your friend, proving how good he is to you, basically, has suggested they merely poke your eyes out. So you've got him to thank.
Because they aren't completely defenseless, are they? They've got the ability to be able to poison and drug him.
Yeah, I mean, even with their arrows are not. Quite a bit. The arrows do have some effect on him, and especially if they poisoned them, which they're clearly capable of.
Yeah, I do feel as though they're made out to be less of a threat than they actually would be, because even at 6 inches, you've got an army of 6-inch people coming after you. They're still going to cause quite a bit of damage. If you've got them cutting at your ankles for a while, you're not going to last too long.
It's not like there's.
You don't have to kill them all, do you?
It's what, sorry? Was that freelance?
I said it's not like there's 7-foot plants.
Yeah.
Yes. The eye poking thing that made me think of the Odyssey, where Homer pokes out the eye of the Cyclops. Also dealing with a larger threat than himself.
It's like a great sea monster has washed up on shore, which is still alive in some way, right? And there's this kind of cruel curiosity that comes out.
You're telling
it made me think of Godzilla.
I want to say it made me think of a kaiju. So
the new series of Love, Death and Robots has an episode which is just all about a giant human corpse washing up on a beach, and it's the same sort of scale. In fact, I'd say it
might be
probably larger scale. Yeah. But the whole thing is just like the decomposition of this corpse and people like stealing bits of it, and you just see like a thigh bone hanging above a butcher's shop and stuff like that.
It's probably better than blowing it up with dynamite. That's always a bad idea.
One example of the scale and the sort of pettiness theme is the fact that he calls the king the emperor, and he talks about his empire being 12 mile radius or something like that. I think he's kind of poking fun at the I think it's George I at the time, right? And who was becoming emperor at that time. The empire was expanding. I don't think they called him emperor yet, but this idea that what is ultimately a small island in a big world has kind of got these very puffed up ambitions. I think that's the effect that he's trying to create there.
I think you're right on that. That even though they're small, even though they're a small nation, they see themselves as being kings of the world, and having territory that expands the globe, because to them this war between England and France, or Lilliput and Blefuscu, is the world. So I definitely see there being allusions to that small people have a bit of a Napoleon complex.
I like the fact that the thing that constitutes a decent governor of state or whatever is their ability to dance.
Yes, there's a few things like that where that this is another part that I like, that it doesn't go too much into it. It's not pages and pages of this is how this society works, but they make reference to the fact that that traitors are immediately executed, but if they provide enough evidence to show that they're innocent, the accuser gets immediately executed, and then the accused takes possession of all of their holdings. Things like that, where it's a way of Swift is trying to put in little nuggets of different ways in which nations can can exist, and different kind of cultural anomalies. And I think this is why the inclusion of Japan is so interesting, because it seems alien to us going through it. But then by putting in Japan and having in customs that are real, it's also seems alien, but we know it exists. So it in some ways turns what's alien about these other nations into something that makes more sense and could be more real.
Yeah, there are these bits of verisimilitude in the story. He also does things like he says, elsewhere, I'm also working on a history of the princes of this nation, Lilliput, which, to increase the sense that there's a reality, that it's like grounded in reality. Of course, it's not. He's not trying to get us to fully accept it as real, but he's playing on travelogue, which is what Thomas More was doing with Utopia as well, like the sort of genre of travelogue, the age of exploration, the shipwreck narrative, and these were grounded in actual explorations.
And he does try and add to the mythos by having in some of the editions the letter that was included with the first manuscript to the publisher.
Yeah,
and then having a rebuttal letter by Swift to I think his name was Samson, who was meant to have sent it in to get published. So you have this sort of bickering about some of the specifics in the book itself about the book, because it's not Gulliver that sent this off to get published. It was a relative of his who was left with the manuscript. So having that kind of thing it's that to me is actually quite a modern way of adding. It's a modern device of adding authenticity to it. So it's quite interesting to see it being used here.
A bit like stopping halfway through it.
I think like this is the age of the novel, and so that this kind of thing was going on. Like you had the epistolary novel, and people were trying to play with different things to create a sense of verisimilitude. And so, you get these kind of literary games that increase that. It makes it easier for more. Creates a stronger sense of reality for us. Ironically, by creating more fictions.
I would have thought at the time it was written as well that the ability for the average person to travel wasn't very great. So, including a bit of Japan in among a lot of made-up places, kind of adds a bit more credibility to it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That by including somewhere that people know is, that Japan is most certainly real, but it's a foreign nation that has strange customs. You've planted that in with other places that don't exist, but it does add to the authenticity of them, because there's no people can't deny that there's Japan. So why not these other nations? Just when I was looking through notes about the publication of the book as well, I saw that Robinson Crusoe came out 9 years previous, and in some ways this was meant to be a response to Robinson Crusoe, which just found it interesting that two of my favorite books that we've covered so far both seem like a rebuttal to Robinson Crusoe, because Lord of the Flies was also that. So maybe sometime we should do Crusoe and see how bad it really is, or how inaccurate it is to human nature.
It's an interesting book.
So have we got anything else to cover on Lilliput?
I think we've covered the main things.
I just wanted to it's pre-Lilliput, but it's the he talks about the name of the ship's master on his way there.
Yes, so I did have this noted down. Yeah, you can carry on. Yeah.
Which was always a joke I'd heard attributed to Pugwash, Captain Pugwash, which I think was not true, but it must be from this, which is the name of the master is Master Bates, which he just glosses over very rapidly, but I can't help but thinking is a little intentional.
That was in no way accidental. That he gets closer and closer to saying it as well, because it starts off with Mr. Bates, my master. And then you're like, oh, well, is he actually going to just come out with it? And yes, he then talks about Master Bates, and then I believe that immediately after there's someone on the ship called Swallows, So, yes, I don't think any of this was going on accidentally. This is
There
what
was
he's a bit crude.
Roger the cabin boy, though. That was the one I was expecting. To...
No.
There's a lot of things designed to give you a bit of a titter, though, isn't there?
Yes.
Like throughout the book. You know,
yeah, this is what I mean. A lot of this kind of crudeness, I don't know. A lot of the time, I really don't like it. But there's something about the way that Swift includes it that I appreciate.
He just talks like a sailor. That's what I think.
it's also nice to see someone who's so willing to fit into cultures that they've arrived at.
He's not really somebody who comes in and says, well, we'll do it my way and I will not adapt. He seems to be very malleable to the point that when he leaves a culture, he has become part of it and he can only perceive the rest of the world through their lens. And this becomes worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, he has a permanent state of culture shock at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, which in some ways could be a criticism of it, that he does seem to immediately take on the the culture that he's in.
Well, maybe he doesn't feel he's got one.
Well, yeah, that is also possible.
Yeah, but Britain doesn't have a culture, right?
Well, yeah,
it's an idea.
He's very, he's very positive towards the Empire, isn't he, throughout the book?
And nobles as well. Their most excellent being.
Well, yes.
Despite blah 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 blah.
He's positive only so that it sets up Swift to lambast British politics with the other characters criticizing it.
Yeah, I think
as we see with the king in this. Sorry, carry on, Justin.
Or just, I think the effect is intentional to have like his most excellent blah blah blah, but then there's a contrast with the character doesn't rise to the level of nobility that he should.
I mean, that really kicks in later on in the book, doesn't it? When he's visiting the people of the past, which we'll cover later, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happens here? Carry on, Freelance.
Yeah, after he goes to the country of the really small people, of course, on his next voyage, he has another accident. And he ends up in the country of the really large people, which is somewhere in the Pacific, because there has to be some land between California and Japan. And these people, they live in the kingdom, but they don't travel, and they don't have any real enemies. And on this peninsula, which on one side is there's a high volcanoes mountain range, and the rest is just rocky shores, so there are no harbors. And they just live there, and everything is big. So their fish are big, their birds are big. Everything is just gigantic size.
Even the weather is bigger.
Yes.
Like the hailstones are larger.
So
in the original edition, there is a map which I put on Discord showing the location of Dignik, which is actually in the northwest, British Columbia at the time, an unmapped, unknown territory. So it's off there. It's north of California somewhere.
That explains a lot.
Yeah.
He chooses places that are just massive bodies of water, so that people could justifiably expect something to be there. So he's very clever with the positioning of these islands. We also see that with Lugnag when we come on to that. The positioning of it, I think it's pretty close to where there is a Chinese myth of this island of the immortals, so he kind of it ties in with an actual pre-existing myth. Yes. So what happens here once he gets found? Bloke, do you want to cover this part?
Yeah, I mean, it's not so much on the first island. There's a sort of shipwreck incident, whereas this time they're just they're popping onto the island to resupply, and then he sort of goes off and comes back to discover his crew furiously rowing off into the distance. As at that point, he doesn't call them a giant human; he calls them some sort of freakish creature or something. Is chasing them out to sea, and then he decides to go further inland and ends up amongst the cornfield, about to be stepped on by a peasant or something, and spends some time as a kind of a pet of this this farmer, basically going around on display to the point where he is probably going to die in the next sort of month or so of this lifestyle, because for him riding on a horse that's like 60 feet high or whatever it was, more than that I think, is like, he said it's like being on a ship that's at in a storm the whole time. So, you know, galloping for miles and miles and miles, just generally takes its toll on him. But luckily, he ends up making his way into the into royalty, and suddenly he's kind of like gets a gilded cage instead of a less gilded one, I suppose.
And he's taken the farmer's daughter takes him under a wing, doesn't she?
She sort of starts off being the sort of chief carer, and then he brings her in with him when he goes to the royal family, and she ends up sort of carrying him around in a box and on in her hand as they go around. And then there is some lovely, you know, you talked about his sort of body horror of looking at people close up. There's some bits where he sees like people with giant pussing cancerous tumors that he could climb into.
Yeah, a tumor with holes so large that he could climb into it.
Yeah.
So I just tested this out. The Lilliputians are 1/12 of his size, and he is 1/12 of the size of the people on Brobdingnag. So they're going to be about 70 foot tall. So to have a cancer that the size that he could climb into, that's even still, that's pretty large.
Yeah.
That's more than what it is.
Sure, it wasn't.
And the conversation that we've already had, you know, some references to the politics of Britain that we've already seen, but the conversation that he has with the king here is a little bit more on the nose, where he starts to really big up the political establishments of Britain and its structure, and obviously that's when we have the king start to point, put some holes in his idea. And I wonder, this seems to be the first. He's not really affected by his first visit as much as he is after this, and I wonder if it's because of this sort of attack on his pre-established notion of what Britain is and how great it is. Because it's only after these conversations, when they're sort of attacking his view of home, that he starts to have this breakdown, and we obviously see that really come to a conclusion at the very end. What do we think?
Yeah, because at the beginning, even though we know that we're looking at England, he doesn't, see it that way. I don't think initially. He just sees he's in a strange foreign country. He doesn't really think about. He doesn't kind of reference home much, as far as I remember, and he's just kind of looking around him in wonderment. But then he has to start. And here he starts, reflecting more on his country.
Yes, and when he goes back after visiting Lilliput, he's not really affected. He sells the sheep and the other bits that he's brought with him from there, but it doesn't really affect his view of home. It's only after this conversation that he really starts to get disillusioned.
Yeah,
so it doesn't. Sorry, he doesn't have a very positive view of his higher ups, does he? Really?
Well, he does. He does.
When
just
you dig
before
into
this
it,
conversation.
The more he kind of he pretends to, but then when in the way he portrays it within the characters, just the very superficial nature of it, with the curiosities and. Yeah, it's like when he's talking to them when Gulliver's talking to the other characters, and when he's talking about them, it's like he has he holds them in quite high esteem, but the broader picture of the book, he's kind of having a bit of a dig at the people who are supposed to be our betters, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's something that we see in A Modest Proposal, the way that he's writing in this section. He's really glorifying England and then undercuts it at the very end. And the reason it's so effective to me, anyway, is that you're following along and you're agreeing with Gulliver, with him bigging it up to an extent. And then obviously when it undercuts, it's not just Gulliver that's undercutting; it's the reader as well.
The fact that Swift is Anglo Irish is kind of interesting, right? Because he has, he's not, Irish Catholic, but he did have a lot of sympathy, I think, for the Irish Catholics.
Yes, from what I understand, he both loved and hated Britain and Ireland in equal measure. He's sort of an Irish nationalist that seemed to despise a lot of the Irish because I think in some ways it's the victim mentality that he already saw being prevalent in Ireland. And obviously in equal measure, he felt that the Irish being unjustifiably treated by the British, which is obviously the whole reason of him writing Modest Proposal, is satirizing people that think that the Irish should just disappear. Pull themselves up by their bootstrap. They've got the means to sort themselves out by just eating their own infants. That was what was alluded to in Modest Proposal, and I think that he kind of hated both in equal measure, but also had an affection for both Ireland and England at the same time. He was very conflicted. It
gives him a kind of interesting, comparable perspective in a way, right? Because he is and isn't an Englishman himself. He is and isn't in England. He's in and yet out of England. Yeah.
And again, just on the poetry side of things, there's one that really sums this up that I'm just trying to pull up. Just bear with me. Someone talk whilst I'm doing this, otherwise it's going to be very boring.
Swift was the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is the Church of Ireland Protestant cathedral in Dublin. So he had, as a member of the kind of ruling class at the time, he had a special kind of position where he was very much part of the English. He was part of the English governing class, but he also identified with the Irish at the same time. And he was a kind of member of the establishment, but outside the establishment too.
Well, I can understand that if you that you might see both sides of the coin, and it's also something that's reflected in this book. He's able to look at all these, or create all these satirical societies, which are basically different sides of humanity as it is. So you have people who are really petty. You have people who really don't really care about the small stuff and only see the big stuff because they're the big themselves. You have the people who are purely set on science. You have people who are purely concerned with what the dead were doing, and then you have in the end people who are going purely for being harmony in the group and stamping out every form of individuality. And he's seeing that probably in society within different groups of people. And what if you had a society which was completely composed of these people? And in that sense, this makes this a bit maybe a proto-science fiction book, as in that it just explores different sociological constructs.
Yeah, I definitely think it is.
I have found what I was looking for. Sorry, finish off.
Not just because of the Isle of Laputa, but the whole sort of thing of speculative fiction about possible worlds.
Yeah. The poem that I was referencing is called Holyhead, and it really, even though it's not particularly long, it really sums up his umming and ahhing about his positions on both. It's a lot of his poetry is very samey. It's it's A, B, B all throughout. He doesn't really vary it up that much. But when he's putting in some of his Swiftian wit, that's when it really shines through. So look up Holyhead. Right. Is there anything else we want to cover on here, or go on to Laputa?
Well, since we're talking about science fiction, let's go on.
Yes.
I have to duck out at this point. I'll catch you guys next week.
No problem. Talk to you later.
Okay.
He has only read the first half of the book and he doesn't want to get spoiled.
That's a good sign that he wants to finish it off. So, Laputa, the whore. Interesting name for a floating island. I think I mentioned in the preamble before we streamed that they changed it in Spain to Laput.
Oh,
so that, yeah. But yes, on science fiction, do you want to go ahead, Justine, and say what you want about Laputa?
Well, his next visit is to an island where, it's a flying island. It very much, as I was mentioning earlier, it's very similar to Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, except New Atlantis was quite serious, and it's also, I think, the Royal Society is probably what is being referenced here as well. The scientific organization. So the people he meets they're sort of he's making fun of scientists. So all the people are excessively focused on odd experiments and with very strange results.
Naval gazing was the kind of phrase that came to mind.
Yes, just on the Royal Society, apparently every single thing that is mentioned as an idea from the Laputians is an idea that was put forward by the Royal Society, or at least based on it. So yeah, it's very clearly that he's alluding to them. Yeah. So sorry, I'll let you carry on. I just want to say naval gazing is an accurate term, but the way that he shows it through their physiognomy is the eye positioning. They've always got one eye staring up into the clouds, and the other eye is looking slightly towards their nose, which is the positioning of the eye whilst looking in. It's a telescope and a microscope is the positioning of the eyes that he wanted to convey. So they're always looking at through some kind of device to look at nature, but they're never looking at it clearly.
See, and this is perfect because the book is, you have that theme of the telescope and microscope effects throughout, right? The things become, and also his own when the Lilliputians, they go through his pockets and they find objects, including a folding. It's like, what does he call it? Perspective glass, something like that. But it's this small folding telescope. So this is constantly alluded to, even in a less explicit way. But yeah, so it's perfect here. Again, we've got this idea of.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. That's a really good point. That it's a good end cap to what we've just been witness to. That this magnifying and view that we've just had of both of these different islands is shown through the positioning. Not just that they're never focusing on reality, but always trying to look at it through some kind of scientific lens. It's also the two different societies that we've just been witness to. Yeah, very clever. Freelance, what were you going to say?
Well, the scientists are called projectors, and what they basically do is they come up with some scientific theory with a lot of promise, like this theory will one day produce this. So whatever you're doing right now, stop doing it. An example is he goes with a nobleman who's really ashamed because he's not he failed to implement the advice of the scientists. So actually his lands and his farms actually still produce stuff, while the other farms are just barren and people are not producing anything because they're waiting for the technology to evolve. And he has this water mill which worked fine, and then the scientists came like, no, you have to build one up the mountain and pump the water up because the high air will activate the water, because there's more bubbles in it or something like that, and that fails, and then the scientists blame him for not investing enough, and the result is that he doesn't have a watermill anymore. So the whole scientific class as it is just purely working with theory and indeed is not working with reality. And then you have just plans of taking excrement and reverting it back to food, and you have somebody who's trying to construct all knowledge from a machine by making sentence fragments. And if only they had more machines of this, then they would be able to compile all knowledge and be done with it.
Yes.
And there are examples of this. There are the blind people who have to discover new colors by just tasting it and smelling it. And so it keeps going on and on and on. Obviously, it's bunk science, but yeah, believe the scientists.
Yeah,
you've got
still going on.
Your reference to cucumbers here as well.
Yeah, what were they trying to make the cucumbers do? I can't remember now.
Capture sunlight.
That was it. Yeah. My favorite one is that they viewed society as a body, and so the ailments that would affect the body would also affect the council. So whenever they meet, they would have physicians there alongside them and check the pulses of everyone involved, and any kind of sickness that they displayed, they expected would then be transferred to the judgment of the council. So they were, trying to lather them up in snake oil to make sure that they were as healthy as possible during the meeting, so that their judgment would be healthy as well as the body. We've swapped slides here, but Balnabari is essentially the ideas that are put forwards in Laputa are manifested here. So the Laputa is the floating island, which is, lofty, floating above the plebeians, and coming up with the ideas. They're up in the clouds, and then it's actually implemented on the ground here. And something that's also mentioned that I liked in Laputa was the measurements for the clothing. They measure up Gulliver for a suit, and when he actually gets it, it doesn't fit at all because someone's messed up on the calculations. And it's only an offhand remark, but it sums it up very well. That he says figures there are quite often incorrectly implemented, but no one notices it. It's just a regular affair that people mess up the figures. But
it was also that all the food was cut into regular mathematical shapes.
Yes, yeah,
or
into the shape of instruments.
Yeah, which is a very obsessive thing to do, to try to conform nature to a certain shape.
As if the floating island is supposed to represent the the government, or
it's the intelligentsia of the societies.
Yeah, and the fact that if the people on the land below don't go along with it, or if they rebel, or if they do anything, one of the the ultimate thing they can do is squash them. So, but if they do that, they risk damaging themselves or destroying, even destroying themselves, which is that was quite a clever, analogy to going back to the whole discussion we had with the monarchs.
Tower of Babel comes to mind with the Laputa. Especially this image makes me think.
Yeah, this image in particular. Yeah. That's also a very good point. What I love about this book is that the more you think about everything that he includes, the smarter it gets. To me, anyway, that there's nothing that's included that the more I think on it, I think actually he's made a mistake there. He could have done it this way. Everything that's in there fits so perfectly to what he's trying to hint at that it always just gets more and more intelligent the more I think on it. So I think he's a great writer in that respect.
And the way what was it with the women? They're always desperate to leave and go to the land below.
Yeah, and cuckold their husbands.
Yeah, but it's like they're like drawn to it, and they all look the same, don't they? It kind of it describes them as all being very similar. kind of plane.
Yes, well, their husbands are so up in the air with ideas, and I mean, we haven't even covered the main part about that, which is the fact that they're so away with lofty ideas that in order to get them to communicate, they have a companion with them who will shoot a pea either at their mouth to get them to talk or at their ear to make them listen. Like that's the level of
the flappers, aren't they?
Yeah, the flappers. That's the level that they're operating on. That they don't care that their wives are cheating because they won't even notice it unless they get a pea shot at their ear to listen to it. So, and they're likely to fall into a ditch if they're not shot with a pea in their forehead or wherever it was to make sure they pay attention. So, again, it really is just he's so against the intelligentsia of the time by saying, look, they know nothing about the on the ground reality of what's happening because they're in the clouds coming up with ideas of turning excrement back into food. You know, they're so far from reality.
It's even like the idea of the head in the clouds, you know.
Yeah.
It's almost as if they want to have a what do you call a peer review paper for everything before they accept it.
Yeah. Have you got a paper to back that claim up, kind of thing? Yeah.
Yeah, just with back to the women though, like it's like they're compelled, aren't they, as well? That they can't help themselves. It's like a dog that as soon as you take the lead off, it's just gone, you know. And that's what the women kind of are like, and they're kind of drawn to these people who abuse them. And they go to find the wife of the king who's missing.
Yeah.
She's held up in some kind of hovel, like she's had to sell her clothes and to look after this guy who's just abusing her.
And still she went back.
Yeah, like they say, they've got some kind of compulsion. They can't help themselves.
Yeah, I think more than anything for that, it's him kind of taking a jab at the people involved in something like the Royal Society and saying, if you're so focused on lofty ideas, your wife is probably playing away. I to me, just because of it being Swift, I think that with that it could be an allegory to some kind of political message, but it's probably him poking fun at the fact that if all you're doing is focusing on ideas and not at home, your wife's playing away.
Yeah, you're sort of looking in the wrong direction. You're missing.
Yeah. You can't see what's right in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a damning indictment, isn't it?
Yes. It's also interesting that they're fascinated with the two things that are mathematics and music. Do you have any thoughts as to why he included music on that?
Patterns, I guess, isn't it? Yeah, because it's the idea that they're not interested in anything anybody has to say. As soon as someone starts talking, if it isn't about either of those two things, then that's it. They just completely lose interest instantly.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose those two things are both held to be kind of universal languages, which has always been a sort of a fashion.
Mm-hmm. There's also a point that somebody makes that they could, the whole thing where people should stop using words and start discussing by showing objects.
Right, yeah.
Which is completely impractical because people have to lug around 3 big bags of objects to hold any discussion. But it's a universal language, and then I had to think about Esperanto, which has a similar thing. Like it might be a universal language, but it's difficult for everybody. There are no native speakers, so there's nobody who will speak it with ease. So it's a very, very intellectual, rational decision to construct a language like that instead of doing something intuitive, like using an existing language.
Yes.
Crazy family recently where they actually somebody was actually brought up speaking Esperanto in the home.
What a horrible existence. Never being able to communicate with anyone.
Like crazed progressive, right, from the 1920s or something.
Yes, and the other big thing that's is referenced is that all these ideas, they're constantly working on the same ones to perfect them, so nothing actually gets implemented. It's always it's always up in the clouds, and they're constantly working on it, but none of it actually comes to fruition because they're seeking perfection. So not only are they destroying what's already there that's working, they're then not even implementing an imperfect idea to make do until they can perfect it. They're just doing nothing until they can get the idea cracked. So it's very damning.
Indeed.
So next we have Glub Dub Drib.
The parts unknown.
The Dante's Inferno sort of reference, I think. So he ends up going to an island of magicians in which he can speak to historical figures, and this is Swift's sort of ability to jab at historical figures and at the current, I think, the current monarch in some ways, because he seems to say that everything that's everything modern, I think he says in the last 200 years. So that would have been for him, from from the Reformation, wouldn't it? Mm-hmm. So that would make sense, yeah. So he's essentially saying anyone from Henry VIII onwards is a fallen figure, which would have been quite a risky statement, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But yeah, any thoughts on this?
It's I think it's a critique on history writing, that people in history are usually made bigger than they used to be, but at the same time he says like modern Britain has been like devolving or like getting corrupted by all kind of diseases that are inherited. So yeah, it's a bit of I think a twofold message, as in that on one side he's trying to tell like all these things like that Hannibal used vinegar to split rocks and stuff. That's all nonsense. That's made up afterwards, and that these were just men at the right time. And on the other hand, he's also making them a bit more noble.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also comparing that the Roman Senate in the beginning, it was all noble men, and in the end they were just all thieves.
Yes, and so Swift is really trying to get Gulliver to question reality, and in turn getting the audience to question it, because Julius Caesar tells Gulliver that his death was great and that he wouldn't change it, essentially, and that Brutus was the most noble man possible. So really trying to take shots fired at some core assumptions that people have.
Also, he took like Aristotle and let him talk to his greatest critics or the greatest writers, and he didn't know them, and he thought they were idiots. Like that kind of stuff. Like the people interpreting them and the people who actually read their writings are actually not the great minds. So yeah, that was kind of that's usually what happens. It's a bit of a never meet your heroes moment.
And when he sees the ancestors as well of the great people, thinking that they must have come from something great to be that great, and they're all thieves and idiots.
Yeah, it's probably the most on the nose section of the book, I think, because it is literally just parading historical figures so that he can throw some accusations out.
Take some chunks off.
Yeah. Still very good though. And anything else on this one? I think this is quite a short section, isn't it? So is the next one that we go to, which is Lugnag.
Nice.
So this is the island in which he finds immortal beings, which are the Stroldbrug, which is one of my favorite names, I think. Stroldbrug is quite fun. There's almost an element of Roald Dahl in some of these terms, and I think that's why I like that one so much. That could be next to Schnozzcumber, and I wouldn't question it. Stroldbrug. Yes, and again, we have more grotesque imagery coming through. So these are a group of immortal humans, which have this red marking on their left eye, or above their left eye. And with Gulliver initially, thinking, "Oh, this is incredible that there's an immortal group of wise men that can guide this nation and can, forever be becoming more and more intelligent and can form this objective committee and do all these great things." With eternal life, eternal youth does not come alongside it.
No.
So
they're in sort of like the worst bit, as though they're about to die, but
yes. And for Swift, what he really focuses on a lot of it is not just the physical decay, but the mental decay. And I think that's what also gets to Gulliver, where in communicating with them, you can't even talk to them properly because they don't remember you from the beginning of the sentence to the end of the sentence.
They almost become zombies. That's basically and they're there and they're immortal, but they don't add anything to society. There's at the beginning, Gulliver fantasizes about what he would do if he was immortal and how he would help people, and basically how he would become an oracle of knowledge. And they turn out to be the exact opposite. So they basically become old people, and then keep on becoming older and older and more senile.
They get declared legally dead, don't they?
They can't even keep because if they were able to keep like property, then they would keep that forever, which would lock it up. So basically, when they turn 80, then they declare dead, and their property is moved on to the next person, and they get a what do you call it, a universal basic income, which is not enough. So they have to beg, which is a faux pas. So they have to use a euphemism to ask for money, like a token of remembrance. So
that could be a dig at like the aristocrats, couldn't it? The way inheritance works, did at the time, and the state of those families as they kind of move on.
Yeah, well, you had poor aristocrats who had a very small handout from somebody who was the head of their house. But it's also that a society basically can't cling on to the past too much because basically you can't develop. So you have to get the society changes over time, and the people who are immortal lose touch with society over time. So they don't even understand the new words anymore because they're incapable of learning something. So yeah, it's a very good observation why you don't want to be an immortal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, not one unless you've got eternal youth as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I once read an article called something like "Life at 200" about these scientists working on various anti-aging therapies. But the the writer invoked this exact thing from Swift at the beginning and talked about like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean like being are you going to be like 95 for 105 years or something like that? What does it mean to live longer if you did like outlive the normal human lifespan? Does that mean being healthy, or does it mean being just like unhealthy for a long time?
Imagine being 200 and then the internet happens, and when you were young, they didn't have steam engines. Like you constantly need to adapt, and it's not just technological; it's also cultural. And that becomes very hard over time. At some point, you become a Luddite. At some point, you don't know what the news is talking about and who are the famous people anymore. You lose interest. And for most people, that happens around 40. And you say, well, 35. They say when you're past 35, you can't enjoy new genres of music anymore. You stick with your old genres. And that effect that also happens with other interests. So yeah, if you keep on doing that, which Swift points out, is that you get people who are basically incapable of functioning in society.
Yeah, and you lose. There's all sorts of problems that arise with the normal sort of seasons of life. If you're just perpetually alive, and then you sort of displace you take resources and displace the younger people who would get, would normally inherit things from you and all this kind of thing. There's no seasons anymore in this new model. Like the people who can afford to live forever just become this other type of human being,
Yeah.
Yes, and we see that happen with them in society, where beyond the age of 80, they're considered legally dead. So all of their holdings are taken and given to their family. Otherwise, they would, just slowly envelop the entire country, because it is at random. It's just on this island for whatever reason. Some of them are born with this red mark above their eye, and they're immortal. It slowly changes color as they get older. And one part I did enjoy is that he says that if two of them are found to have the immortality, they're legally not allowed to marry, because no man should suffer twice the burden of being immortal and having to be married to someone forever as well. It's like no one should have to put up with a wife for eternity.
Well,
So
that could work the other way as well. Like, no one should have to take care of this guy for
Probably why the Wikipedia article on this book just talks about misogyny for about 10 paragraphs.
yes, well,
I have no idea why. Wasn't it at one point they talked about a man queen or something?
a man queen.
Yeah, I know this is maybe an odd way of writing, but anyway.
I'm not sure. Just on this idea as well. This is a very base reference to pop culture. This has been something that's always been in my mind ever since an episode of Doctor Who, in which the Doctor gets rapidly aged. I'm just going to pop a little picture of him there. I don't know why. It's always been something that I've enjoyed.
Isn't that the episode called "The Sound of Drums"?
I think you're right. Yeah. It's just the imagery. It's not horrific, but it's a certain body horror of that you can age. You can constantly age and you'll survive, but your body will still deteriorate. There's something about that idea that is slightly horrific.
Well, even if you had eternal youth, if you didn't have like Wolverine-like regeneration, you would like lose a limb, and also people would become bigger, so you would be like really small. You'd be odd after like 500 years. You would look really different.
Yeah,
and you'd have to keep up your actual language as well. You could be talking a dialect that is just completely unknown.
Well, that might not be so hard.
Years.
If you keep on talking to people, it kind of happens automatically. So that's not that big of a problem.
Have you seen Death Becomes Her?
Yes, I have seen Death Becomes Her. Yeah, that's with Bruce Willis and Meryl Streep, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a Zemeckis film.
It is a Zemeckis film.
They start falling apart, don't they?
Yeah.
Right, on to the next, before we get onto our tangents section.
Also, on the misogyny front as well, especially with the depiction of what the women do to Gulliver when he's little.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, it's pretty raucous, isn't it?
It's true.
Yes, yeah, and again, that kind of hints to
astride her nipples and undressing him and parading him around, and
he's a little doll to play with.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're using him essentially as a doll.
A little bit repressed.
Like the scene with the dwarf, that he has all these troubles with the
yes.
poor dwarf, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's funny.
The jealous dwarf, because he's no longer the smallest.
Cute little small thing.
He keeps trying to kill him.
Reminds me of having two dogs, where the one dog terrorizes the other one when the owner is not there.
So,
Japan.
Oh, the fictional country of Japan, yeah.
Yeah.
A great deal happens in Japan, apart from, as I say, to make sure to bolster the reality of the book, I think. But there's also a few references to the Dutch-Japanese relationship, which I was pretty unaware of.
I must say that the second half of the book is pretty racist towards the Dutch. The Low Dutch, to be exact.
Rightfully so.
It starts with a captain who swears in Dutch, and I could give some examples, but I imagine that it's mainly diseases, kanker, tering, leier, things like that. So you just in Dutch, if you curse, you at least in not Flemish Dutch, but in Dutch, North Dutch, you wish diseases upon the other. So you wish them to become ill and get all these kind of like pestilence and plagues and stuff like that. So I imagine that this Dutch captain does that to him, which he understands because he studied in the Netherlands. The thing when he goes to Japan, at the time, Japan was only allowing Dutch people to enter the country. So if you're Portuguese, you would basically be, I think, executed on the spot. While the Dutch traders would be concentrated in Deshima, which is a small artificial island in the port of Nagasaki. And that's why he pretends to be a Dutch person, or from the Netherlands at least. And having studied in Leiden, which is in Holland, near Rotterdam, he's able to pretend that he's a Dutchman, but he almost is discovered because he doesn't want to trample a crucifix, which the Dutch do, obviously.
Clearly.
Clearly, because they're not Catholic or Anglican.
The Portuguese were the first Europeans, I think, and then the Dutch after that, right? To reach Japan.
Yeah. He's almost being accused of being a Christian. So you're not Dutch, you're a Christian. Odd, but.
But that is an accusation being thrown at him by a Japanese person. So I suppose maybe there.
Yeah, maybe. We'll get you back for that one. So yeah, that's the reason why he pretends to be a Dutch sailor who got lost, and I don't think somebody from Japan could tell the difference. But of course, other Europeans. Probably, yeah,
they all look the same. Dutch, English,
It's all Dutch to me.
Yeah, they all hate the gaijin.
Exactly.
So he pretends to be an Oranda-jin, an orange man, and.
Yes, bad.
There's so much orange man hate in this book, as if orange men are bad.
The Dutch people take that personally, but
what?
Sometimes somebody insult Trump, you're like, what?
Trump? What has Trump to do with it? the Japanese word for Dutch person is Oranda-jin, which means orange man.
And that actually.
It had to come out.
I just love the lo-fi way it happens.
Yes.
So yeah, the reason is that only people from the Netherlands were, or from at the time the Republic of the Seven Provinces were allowed to reside inside of Japan as foreigners, and that's why he pretends to be Dutch. So yeah.
So I don't think there's anything else to cover on Japan. Let's go on to the land I've been avoiding saying.
The women's. It's not that hard. You just have to pronounce the third H really hard.
Women's.
Yes.
Is that the correct?
You have to nail it.
You really got to focus on the H.
Women's. Yeah.
You have to nail it.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yes. So he gets mutinied against and is thrown out to make his own way to the nearest land and comes across these lovely creatures here. So you've got the Yahoos and the Huimins.
The Yahoos look like satyrs here or something.
Or goblins.
Yeah, there's something a little bit interesting about them. Grotesque, not in the modern sense, but in terms of, you'd see this off the side of a Gothic cathedral.
Almost hinted that they're not created in God's image, as it is, and that's so that they're not real men.
Or that they're Irish, which is my theory.
Why do you keep repeating what I'm saying?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's not so subtly done that. Yeah, the Yahoos are the Irish. Particularly, we find that at the end when they're having a conversation about whether or not they should ethnically cleanse the Yahoos off of the land. And yes, let's go through it. So, what are the Yahoos and what are the women's?
So the Yahoos represent the absolute baseness of human nature, the base side of human nature, and the kind of base appetites, the crudest possible version of a human being. And the Houyhnhnms, which are horses, represent the kind of higher faculties, and they're very virtuous and very rational, and they can't lie. They don't lie.
They say that the horse is the noblest animal, and this is personified. So that they're anthropomorphized into rational beings, and to the point that they see rationality as a virtue. So there's nothing beyond that. So then for them, having all this baseness is like they keep them around as pack animals. The Yahoos.
Mm-hmm.
And they're amazed when they see Gulliver, because Gulliver actually has some rationality. And they saying, "Well, how can this be to have a Yahoo with rationality?" That goes against what they consider to be real, because they thought, well, that couldn't happen.
First, they don't realise he's they see him as slightly less of a Yahoo because of his clothes. It's not till later when they see him.
Not all Yahoos is sort of the.
Another thing is that the women's language is quite limited. So they just don't have certain concepts in their society, so they don't have a word for that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard to explain some things to them. And so it takes him a while to explain some things that happen in England. So he explains that they have horses, but they're used as work animals, which they think is horrific. So and they immediately assume that it's just a ploy, because the horses in the UK are still running everything, but they're just acting like that. Because how could this be that the humans would be on top?
Horses are an inside job.
Yeah. Maybe that's true.
No, I can see one out the window. It doesn't look like it's up to much.
Well, can you see him out the window, or is he looking?
Yeah, horses.
It's just lying down.
You have a horse in your garden?
Yeah. So when we come to the society, what I think is interesting is that a lot of the intelligentsia will see themselves as being the Houyhnhnms, whereas they'll actually end up coming out as a Laputan.
No, it is even worse. So they seem to be really noble, but the solution is genocide. So
they get the idea off Gulliver, don't they? That when he's telling them about the fact that they castrate the horses, that could be a solution to their problem without having to kill anyone.
The issue is that their rationality rules them entirely, and it also informs their moral code. So, there's essentially a form of eugenics, and there's essentially a caste system because of the certain genetic predilections that some of them have compared to others.
Another reason why it could be horses is because horses are a pack animal, and they how they describe their society is that it's very regulated top down. So it's almost like they have a planned economy, and they also do everything for the group. So it's almost like proto-socialism. The way they feel.
I actually kept, and I know we always refer to this, maybe I've just got it in the brain, but when I was reading their description of society, it was making me think again of the progressives from the 20s, because it's that combination of eugenics and socialism.
It might be that you just have people who are staunch anti-individualist, or rather that they like to be in a group. So they will put the group in front of the individual, while other people will put the individual in front of the group. And that you will always have a clash between these groups of people. So, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were like socialist or social movements back in those days already, but not as organized and maybe not as violent as we have. Although I'm not quite sure how. This is probably still before the
before
70,
the Chartist
80.
movements.
Before the French revolutions and such, because
during the English Revolution there was a bit of that going on.
I recently saw a really interesting video on that, Justine. And
send me a link.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Everybody
Shameless.
watched this video. Shameless plug for Justine's video, which was great. Everybody should.
Got a new video if anyone wants.
The American Revolution is more about individuality, but the French Revolution is really about the group.
Mm-hmm.
The group ideal. So you have the Paris Commune, which also happened after that.
Was it really about individuality, or is that the reframing that we've put in it?
Maybe, but I think it was about tea.
I wonder.
But anyway, you before that, something like the French Revolution happened. You will have these movements that happened years before that, already setting it up. And that could be something that is alluding that some people, they want to have we want to have some kind of equality and everybody has to be the same, or everybody needs to be provided by the state. Maybe that's something better to say. Like they don't want to do it themselves. Somebody else should do it for them. And some people might be happy with that, and some people would be horribly not happy with that. And given the fact that Gulliver is somebody who really quickly adapts to his surroundings, I guess he's somebody who would be happy if somebody would take care of him. So that's probably why he wants to be a horse.
The ending is very interesting. He ends up.
So.
There's also the way he gets stranded gets more extreme each time as well, doesn't it?
Why does he bother?
There's an acceptance that to live in this utopian society, you can't actually be a human.
Yes, you can't be the outcast.
You have to let go of all humanity to get the society that you're trying to achieve for humanity. So in that way, you can see it as a truly misanthropic piece.
And the thing that you're giving up is the terrible bit of humanity. Yeah, which is kind of one of the criticisms we got.
The fact that he becomes, so alienated, and even from his own people, family, that he can't bear them anymore. I think it's a bit of an indictment somewhere of these ideas, right?
Yes. Well, I didn't get through all of it, but I brought up a response to Gulliver's Travel by Orwell. And he said that the Hwynnim were as close to dead as possible while still being alive. So that kind of that removal of any humanity from them, which is meant to be their, what makes it so enticing, is to him is what makes it so hideous, because you're putting rationality above everything.
I find them quite chilling, actually.
It constructs your moral system as well. Sorry, what did you say? Sorry.
I do find them chilling ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It goes back to the rationalism of the people on the floating island as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, with this society, they would have no qualms about signing the death of millions of people if it meant that the greater good was achieved. I think that's kind of what Orwell is hinting at with this.
Yeah, with the mass castration, and
and it's something that can be very easily brought up in conversation with no second thought about the actual moral implications of that.
It's almost as if they can turn fascist on a dime.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if fascist is exactly the right word, but I see what you mean.
at least collective authoritarian.
It goes back to Plato's Republic, doesn't it? I mean, I'm pretty sure that he is referencing Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
Plato's solutions are quite cold this way as well.
Mm-hmm.
His perspectives.
Yeah.
In a way, I mean, the two creatures, like the Yahoos and the Houyhnhnms, they seem like dimensions of human nature that should be integrated in some sense, and that's in a way the problem with both of them is that they lack some. They're lacking.
It's a very polarized society where you have these two groups which no longer communicate with each other and they have different goals, and that never ends well.
Yeah, there's a sort of the psychological characterization that you could use is the elephant of the rider. That's used quite a lot of, the sort of base impulses are the yahoos that should be controlled by the rider, but they're actually not.
Which in this case is a horse.
Yeah, yes.
Which is the funny part.
Yes, exactly. The rider should be in control, but obviously the rider is the horse. But instead of working in tandem, there's a segregation there. So neither side feels quite right because they're not working together. Which in some, it could be a criticism of the book because what you'd expect, maybe in a more politically on the nose book, would be. We've seen from every society some kind of attack on different elements of society. And what you'd expect the final society that he lands in to be would be, the ideal that he's putting forwards. The big question is this actually what he's doing? Is he putting forward this rational society, or is he just putting forward yet another society that has issues? So is it misanthropic, or is it sort of a guide?
Well, what you see is that he gets infected by the ideas of that society.
Mm-hmm. Well, Gulliver does, but what is Swift aiming for?
Oh, Swift.
I'm asking.
I don't know. The final society ends up as England, right? Where he has to adapt to the smelly humans.
That's true. Yeah, no, that's true. I suppose that you could say that the final place he lands on is England, and it's just as out of water to him now as Lilliput was at the very beginning. So that could be one way of answering that.
Yeah, he became an internationalist.
What are you going to say, Justine?
I mean, there's something a bit sad about it, right? That he comes back and he's so alienated. In a way, it's funny, but it's also kind of sad because he never acclimatizes. But one of the effects of the book is to kind of make things strange that are familiar. There's a name for this, but it's like for example, like when the Lilliputians go through his pockets and they describe all these things, and you're trying to sort of what are they referring to, and then he lists them later on, so you know for sure what they were referring to. But one of the he's trying to make you look at things with fresh eyes, and
was it two copper tubes with big wooden chunks to them, and it turned out to be his pistols.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and actually it's funny that you say it's a proto science fiction book, because that is obviously a device that's used a lot in science fiction. I think every time we've read something sci-fi, there's something poking out that does that. It tries to put something jarring in for what is familiar to make the strange more believable, because you're already questioning the familiar. So
the whole perspective shift is one of those things, like starting like science began with looking through telescopes and microscopes, and that's the first two parts of the book, is just looking through society that way. And when you look at from a really large perspective, people's personal problems seem really petty. And when you look at it from the other way around, you see that people don't care about a lot of stuff. Like when he describes the skin of the people in Dignik, the giants, that is really ugly and full of thick hairs and things like that. Things that actually on closer examination are not that pretty, even though they're pretty ladies. And when he's talking about the Lilliputians, they're all pretty because he can't see their wrinkles and things like that. They almost look angelic. And that's something that happens in science. When you put something under an electron microscope, a hair, it becomes like this big thick tube, which is not pretty at all. It looks very different. And that's basically the effect that he's describing. And this is a very scientific way of looking at things, even back in the day, because I think it was around that time. Well, telescopes, they probably had a bit longer, but the microscope was invented by Van Huygen, if I remember correctly. A Dutch guy made one, and you suddenly could look at plant cells which was like, okay, the plants are made out of cells. We didn't know, and so that's kind of also what's happening in this book. So in that case, I think it's a early science fiction in that regard.
Which society was it where he tried to basically sell them the idea of guns, and they were having it?
That's the second one.
The giants, yeah.
Yeah, because they thought it was horrific, because they had no need for an army or war, because they had no natural enemies. They had an army because back in the past there was some internal strife, but it seemed to be more ceremonial than anything else.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
So in a way, the Brobdingnagians, they come across quite good. And
yeah, they're probably out of the lot the society you'd want to live in the most, even if you do get forced to dance to death for the amusement of people in the pub. Still probably the best one that they have.
It does talk. I mean, he does talk just about the effects of travel in general, I'd say. I mean, if you've ever had the experience of going to another country and spending a long time and going through stages of, at first maybe you're like excited, and then you start, getting different forms of culture shock, and then you start thinking about home, being nostalgic, but then you start, there are all these different kind of emotional states, and you compare, you kind of learn, you see your society because you're contrasting it with the new society. I had this.
I hate going on holiday.
Yeah, I had this experience living in France for a while, and sort of experience. I was intensely nostalgic a lot of the time, but then there are things it does shift your perspective a lot and force you to look at things differently.
Down and out in Lilliput and Blelfusky, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Let's move on, unless there's anything else, to the final section, which I've covered most of what I have noted down already, which is the critical response. Most of them I've already dropped piecemeal throughout, but the one thing I wanted to mention is that contemporary critics, a few of them complained that the satire was too overt, which just made me laugh, because I just was trying to think of anything modern, and the two examples that came to mind were Team America and things by Sacha Baron Cohen. And I just think if they thought that the satire here was too overt, good Lord, what would they think about modern satire? Everything is so on the nose now that it just doesn't even bear comparing.
I mean, you have to shock, don't you? Otherwise, nobody pays attention.
Yeah. So that for me concludes everything that I've got down, and I think we covered that very nicely. Any final thoughts before we finish up?
Good book. Go read it.
Yeah, we haven't actually done recommendations, but everyone should go and read it. This is actually up there. I was umming and ahhing, comparing it in my mind to Animal Farm, and I'm still undecided, because every time I read this, I like it more. So it's getting close. So
I would say that Animal Farm is better because I think it's easier to read, maybe better written. Not as imaginative, but it focuses on a single point, and this has like 4 books, basically 4 sections. And I would recommend that the first 2 are maybe a bit slow or not that exciting, but I think the latter 3 are the better, or the latter 2 parts are the better parts of the book. And don't read the abridged version, because you're gonna miss out on stuff.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Well, that concludes Gulliver's Travels, and the next book that we'll be doing will be in 2 weeks' time, which will be A Clockwork Orange. So some from incredibly difficult to read naming conventions to incredibly difficult to read naming conventions. So there's always a through line with these books.
Okay, droogies.
Alex, good boy, Alex.
Oh, that's going to be a fun one. Yeah. I'm going to definitely give the audiobook a try for this as well, because I can picture it either going very well or very badly. I'm not sure which.
Well, what about the words that you need to look up, during the audiobook? Do they stop and say like,
I've got no idea.
Yeah. Because
if you're not familiar with it, it's going to be impossible to understand what the hell's going on.
I saw the movie. I'll be fine.
Yeah, you should read the glossary first, maybe, and then listen to the.
It reminds me a bit of when Wayne's World came out, and they had, when you would rent it in the video stores, they had cards where they would explain all the things like "excellent dude" and to the Dutch audience, because there's no reason why that movie would be popular in the Netherlands, because it's a Saturday Night Live movie. But yeah, it still was. So
it's a bit like this when they have to subtitle films like Snatch. With the or Lock, Stock.
I'm still waiting for the DVD release of The Madness of King George 1 and 2.
I wanted to slip that bit of trivia in somewhere after you told me, but why don't you explain that?
Well, the movie The Madness of George III is in the US called The Madness of King George, because they would think that the Americans would think it was a third part in a series that ended with a 3, like Rocky 3.
Coincidentally, we're just in the middle of watching that movie. It's good.
What?
The Madness of King George.
What?
What? I fell for that. We're just, it's very well done. I think it's quite a good one. Another thing to recommend to the audience, in addition to Gulliver's Travels.
Yes, and Freelance is watching the Jack Black version of the film. How's that?
I'm already finished. So it's just the first book in a modern setting with a love interest. Totally true to the original. I mean, in the end, he loves his wife, right? Right.
There's a Channel 4 version as well, isn't there? Is that any good? Has anybody seen that one?
We only have 3. We only have 3 channels in the Netherlands, Quack House, so I don't know.
Right, enough of this madness. Let's go. See you in a couple of weeks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.